Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Giovanni Brusto, and this is the Media Mogul News Update. I am here today with veteran media strategist Lee Spieckerman. And Mr. Spieckerman he doesn't need a host, he doesn't need a moderator. If anyone's ever seen him on cable news, I think that he is just fine all by himself. But I've got him on today as a guest. How are you doing, sir?
Hi, it's terrific, and you can call me Lee, but Mr. Speakerman, I appreciate the formality and you're in Virginia, state known for its gentlemen, so that's a very gentlemanly way to refer to me. But you can call me Lee, better than some things other people have called me for sure.
Right. And so, well, first, how has the year treated you? How have you been surviving 2020? I know we've got about 30 days, what? No, a week left. So,
Well, the biggest development I think that's occurred in our country is that you've grown a beard. I think that's development over it. I mean, nothing much else has happened in 2020, right? Just your beard. But it is, I live here in Texas in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Texas overall is doing very well in the midst of a tragic pandemic. Our state is doing relatively well and is relatively opened up. So on that score, we're much more fortunate than California. So, and you can tell I'm a veteran on TV since I have to push my IFB back in my ear. But anyway, so getting by, and grateful to see the vaccines, the rapid deployment of the development and deployment of the vaccines.
yeah.
So that's certainly very positive. And when my turn is there, when it's the right time for me, I'll certainly take the vaccine.
Yeah, I know there's plenty of debate about it. I'm definitely going to be in line. For some time, I just said that, the goal for 2020 was just to be able to get to January 1st alive. It's been stressful for a lot of us. I mean, I campaigned through the year and whatnot. I mean, I started off, in the spring. I probably didn't leave the house for like 2 months or something, you know. But life goes on. We have to get out. But yes, I'll be taking it as well. So one thing that's going to be inevitable that looks like we'll likely see under the Biden administration will be marijuana legalization. And something that part of my view on this was looking at Ben Carson when he ran for president. He said that he wasn't as interested in legalization as he was stating that he wanted to look into the reason that people were actually doing it to begin with, as far as their coping mechanism. And also, you might have noticed the state of Oregon just recently decided to legalize practically everything.
Right.
I think mostly in small doses, or small amounts that they're carrying.
Right. So
Any
you're
thoughts
not a
on?
drug kingpin, something less than what a drug kingpin would possess, I guess, or a street dealer
Right,
would possess.
right. Any thoughts on Oregon's legalization there?
Well, I guess that's one of the positive aspects of federalism is we get to see what happens in Oregon. I mean, every state is different.
Right,
And the idea of if something as dangerous as many of these drugs are being legal, and having more opportunity to trickle down and be available to children, certainly minors, is very concerning. I'm not one of those that's favored, complete drug legalization. I certainly don't think that weed should be criminalized. I don't think people should be put in jail for things related to weed. But as with everything else in our society, in a republic, with a democratic republic where people can express their desires on these issues and weigh in, you balance things. You don't go all one way or the other.
right.
There's no perfect decision and no perfect system, and
And
we
you're in
have a
Texas.
system where we can adjust it as necessary. So let's see what happens in Oregon before any other states do it, and certainly before the entire country considers any wholesale drug legalization.
Right. And at the same time, you're in Texas, so you're up against the border. So you
Right.
definitely have a different scenario. than Portland, which tends to have a history of being rather extreme on just about everything.
Yeah, and of course, one of the arguments in favor of drug legalization is it makes drugs more available. When you take out the black market, the price goes down, and there's much less incentive for the criminal element to try to smuggle drugs into the country and
Right.
to sell them illegally in the country. So that's an argument. And as a Texan, anyone on the U.S.-Mexico border, Arizona, et cetera, the thought of having less pressure on the border and less drug smuggling and less of a criminal element near the border or involved in the drug trade is a big positive. But again, you have to look at the health impact
Right.
and does legalization give a state sanction to drug use? Is that making a statement to young people and even adults that
Right.
hey, drugs aren't so bad. If they were bad, they wouldn't be legal.
Right.
So it's a lot of things have to be considered. It's again, Oregon's doing this. Let's see. I hope it's being studied very closely. I hope we get real statistics and really see what the impact is on drug use, on crime, on all of the areas where that are affected.
Right. And just to tell you how crazy the 2020 is, I mean, I think that I came across that story, I think just in a Google headline. And I said, I don't remember seeing this on the news. And now that I'm aware of it, how often have I seen that? I think that 2 years ago, or just, the one, just right before the president Trump came into office, if anyone had decided to legalize everything, that would have been daily news,
Yeah.
for the entire year. But, just saying, Trump does an amazing
Yeah, when
job
you have a
with stealing
pandemic, a
headlines.
presidential election,
The election that
and
won't ever end.
almost everything except the addition of your beard, almost everything takes a backseat in the news cycle to stories related to those issues.
Right. And just as a sidebar, I met with my police chief here a few times, and one thing that I'd mentioned to him is I found out that Petersburg was listed as a high intensity drug trafficking area, and I think that's a DEA designation. But what's interesting is that, that sounds terrible, but then supposedly 60% of the country's counties are also listed as that.
Wow.
And with that being said, I mean, we must really have a drug problem, or in fact, is it really that bad? So that's partly why I'm looking at Oregon to see what happens. I partially support. There's a group called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and they feel that a good amount of our crime is from the drug trade.
Yeah, no
And
doubt.
yeah, as you said, once those incentives are taken out for the black market, that maybe it won't be so bad. But I'll be keeping my eyes there because Petersburg might have just a little bit of a crime problem. We were on the cover of Time, listed recently for places with for shootings.
Yeah, it's
So
one of the smaller cities. It's like Jackson, Mississippi, and others that nobody. You're always hearing about Chicago and um,
right,
Detroit, but some of these much smaller cities have, in terms of actual crime rate, are considerably higher than Chicago and other large cities that we're hearing about.
right. And so for those who don't know, again, probably the two people, Lee worked on Gingrich's presidential campaign. And so I wanted to know, in seeing the president, Donald Trump, when he received the party nomination, what were your thoughts there? Because of course that was something that just about everyone didn't see, except for like Ann Coulter.
You mean Trump getting the nomination in the first place?
Yes, the first time around.
I was working for Jeb Bush. I was, up in New Hampshire and then down in South Carolina, knocking on doors and was in touch with some of the people that ran his campaign and knew him, and subsequently worked for his son, who's a statewide office holder here in Texas. And there's no. I mean, I met one of the guys who happens to be a family friend. Was one of the top Republican fundraisers in the country and very close to the Bush family. And before Trump, I think maybe just as Trump announced, clearly the prevailing wisdom was that Jeb Bush was going to get the nomination.
Yep.
And he was just, I mean, people forget just what an overwhelming front runner he was, much more so than Biden when the Democratic race started this cycle. I mean, it wasn't even close. In all the polls, Jeb was way ahead. But once Trump announced, very quickly, as you remember, he overtook Jeb and everybody else in the polls and never looked back. In the national Republican polls, Trump was always in the front runner. And so I was not a Trump fan, even though I agreed with it. You know, I came to agree with a lot of his points about trade, which he'd been talking about for decades. I actually agreed with a lot of his points about what later was coined as America First, which, by the way, I interpret as not as saying America better than every other country or America more important than every other country, but when you're making policy that affects our country, right, America should be the first priority. If the U.S. government and citizens and organizations, corporations, United States should make our country's best interest the first priority. That's what America First means to me. And that includes everybody, whether it's Bernie Sanders or anybody else. It is not a certain ideology. It's simply what's best for the United States, what's most likely to be best for the United States and our people. And so that part of what Trump was saying needed to be said a long time ago. I agreed with him on that. And he also turned out to be a much more brilliant politician than I think anybody dreamed, despite all of his foibles. Yeah. He has, I mean, it's truly stunning that somebody with zero government or political history, in terms of running for office, being appointed to office, won the most important office of all, the U.S. presidency. That's still stunning, even with his loss in 2020. That was just an amazing political achievement. And of course, will always go down in history. We'll probably never see a bigger, we may see as big an upset, but I don't think we'll ever see a bigger upset than that.
You know, I'd have to agree. I don't think so either. And, you know, just what's interesting about what you said as far as America First, I mean, that seems to be common sense. I think that we were growing up as children, that we were led to believe that our politicians are working in the best interest of their constituents. You know, if it's the mayor, you're working on behalf of the people in the city. The same thing goes for the country, but you know, that's kind of not been a thing like as long as I've been alive. So, right, you know, those are exactly the things that he touched on. And like even going back to Ben Carson, when he, you know, some of the coping mechanisms for drug use. When we look at the war on drugs and what the effects are, it's not even really to go after that many people. Just from what I'm aware of, I think that there's like 11 million people using marijuana and like 1 million each for cocaine and meth. I don't know, disputable, whatever. But you know, again, we've made this, you know, a whole industry in policing and going after them. And well, what is one of the reasons why they're using this amount of, you know, illicit substances? It might have something to do with decimating industry, you know, in their parts of the country, like the Midwest.
And it's also the root of the crime, you know, the crime problem in big cities. I mean, the deindustrialization of the United States was just an absolute body blow to the middle class of the United States, and really to everybody else, because you know, when you have, and I've said this on television, when you have the ability to source goods in China or other Asian countries where workers are making $5 a day on average, or less sometimes, then in effect, you know, you end up outsourcing and offshoring all of your manufacturing and your best jobs. And, you know, that's fine if you happen to be an industry that is totally untouched by that, or if you're working on Wall Street, or some of the white collar jobs out there. But it is absolutely devastating for people that have worked in those factories. And then you have to, one thing that nobody ever talks about, it isn't just factory jobs that were sucked out of our country, but incomes were imploded. Because think about it, if folks that would today be making $25 or $30 an hour with full benefits in a factory, if those jobs are no longer available, they still have to work. So what do they end up doing? They end up competing for the waiter, the barista, the warehouse worker jobs,
Making far less.
historically lower paying jobs, because they got to work somewhere and they may not have the skills for a white collar job or to be coding or whatever. And so now you suddenly have this vast influx of what would have been higher paid workers competing for lower wage jobs, which of course lowers wages for everybody. So we've had this downward wage vortex in our country that really can be traced to the 3 to 4 million manufacturing jobs that we lost. And most of those that we lost were due to these trade deals that we made with China, what we've allowed to happen for decades, even with Japan and South Korea, and even the EU and Germany, we have a huge trade deficit with.
Yeah, it's like something like 50,000 factories, I think, that have closed.
70,000.
NAFTA.
Yeah, you hear 60, 70, but it's 60 to 70,000 factories were closed. And it's been devastating. And people were so short-sighted. It's like, well, it's great for the middle class to be able to buy cheap stuff at Walmart. Okay, that can be true, but they also need a thing called an income.
Yeah.
And if literally the difference in earnings between a well-paying, a normal, I don't mean an outlier, but a normal factory job in the United States, and these $15, $14, $13 an hour jobs is over $20,000 a year. I mean, that's a lot of flat screen TVs. I think a lot of those folks would be willing to pay $500 more for a 4K 75-inch flat screen TV if they were making $20,000 more. And if instead of having to get health insurance on the ACA marketplace, or maybe not have health insurance at all, they had a gold-plated, excellent group health insurance plan, which most manufacturing workers in the United States have. So it's nobody is looking at the big picture. And I got on a long dissertation. You were bringing up drug abuse, but to not see the connection between this deindustrialization, the lack of good jobs, the pay that's too low, and the opioid epidemic just means you're shutting your eyes. You're not paying attention. It has a direct impact on the opioid crisis that we have. It has a direct impact on alcoholism, which is still the most abused drug in our country, in the entire world. And so we need, when we're making policy, we've got to look at all of the elements that are involved and all of the people that are affected, not just one narrow slice. And that's, I think, the biggest problem with policy making. Everybody lives in a vacuum. They look at one thing, one cause and effect relationship, and then they fail to take into account the ramifications that are much more widespread.
Yes, and I'll say that one of the things that I learned from President Trump being in office was the fact that, just to give my profile, I mean, I've grown up in DC, and I spent my time working by the White House, and I came home 7 miles across town behind the gate. And, I was not very much outside of that sphere of influence. And I spent 7 years in the World Bank as well. And I really wasn't aware of, the effects of deindustrialization until he started talking about it. And that's really sad. But
by the way, you're not alone. I mean, people.
No, I'm not.
It's one of the most catastrophic changes in our country over the past 30 or 40 years, and
I talk to people
nobody
about it
really talks about it
all the time, and everyone mentions about what great economy that we had under Bill Clinton. And I explain about well, it was good for some people, and it was absolutely horrible for many others. And the ones that it's horrible for, those are the ones that never get spoken about. I didn't even realize how much coal mining made. How much people made there. That's really a big deal. I mean, these are people who are now, as you said, looking at minimum wage jobs who are making like 70,000 before. That's kind of a big deal. If that happened,
it's a very big deal. And if
that happened to people in DC, one, it would be global news, but because it's them, and they have disdain for what they do for a living and for those people, therefore it doesn't matter.
Right, and it is really sad to see. You talked about Washington, D.C., just how decoupled The
Oh yes.
Washington, D.C. bubble is from American reality, not just the government officials and the Hill staffers and the White House staffers and the
Everyone.
bureaucrats, but also the lobbying firms, the media outlets. They are just completely out of sync, decoupled from, in denial about the serious issues that are affecting so many Americans. And we see this spilling over right now with the pandemic, to where folks that live in big, lovely homes and can bring folks in, of course, wearing a mask, for nice dinner parties, or find a way to go to places that will stay open for them, or
Right.
have a lot of options that most people don't have. They don't see the big deal with the shutdown. They don't think it's that big a deal. It's all about public health. But we've seen over and over again politicians, from Newsom to Pelosi to the husband of the governor of Michigan and many others,
Right.
that have been caught basically ignoring the public health
Your own
rules in
rules.
effect, ignoring laws that have been put on the books or regulations, because they think they're entitled to things that the average American is being prohibited from doing. And I think that mentality really took hold in this country starting in the 1970s and 80s. And I think, frankly, you mentioned Bill Clinton. It went on, kind of that way of thinking went on steroids because Bill Clinton basically outsourced his economic policy to Wall Street.
Hmm.
It was this whole free trade paradigm was, frankly, a Wall Street idea and a Wall Street obsession, really. And the rationalization was that it would bring China into the fold and make them a better actor. And of course, it has not worked out that way. What happened instead is that China is now swimming in an ocean of lucre, primarily from its trade surplus with the United States, and they're using that money. That's where they got the money to build up their defense operation and a very nefarious surveillance state on their people. It's where they're getting the money to do high-tech research on a massive scale to overtake the United States in technology.
There's some concern here in America that our trains that they're building, they might be spying on Americans here. If you could imagine.
You mean the high-speed trains?
Some of our subway systems.
Well, I think I'm one of those, and I'm still somewhat of an outlier in this, but I really don't think the United States should have large-scale manufactured goods imports. I think most manufacturing, the vast majority, far more than now, for all goods, certainly goods that are complex like high-speed trains and automobiles, things of that nature, should be manufactured in the United States. I think what people overlook is that the end product that a U.S. consumer buys is only half the equation in terms of the value for the United States. The other big part of the equation is the jobs to produce that product. They go hand in hand. And somehow it's really amazing. For decades, we've had states and cities compete aggressively to have factories relocate to their destination, or to have headquarters move to their city or state. And they provide all kinds of tax incentives, which taxpayers pay for, to get companies, as part of the lure to get those companies to build their factory or build their headquarters in the city or state that's trying to recruit them. And somehow people understand that, but don't understand why the entire United States needs to be doing the same thing and keeping factories here and keeping workers here and keeping jobs here. And that the fact that somebody can buy a flat screen TV cheaply, but the workers making that flat screen TV are in Vietnam or China or some other country, and they're getting the benefit of that, and they have a more stable job, and they are doing well. And meanwhile, the workers in the United States are deprived of those opportunities. People aren't thinking about that. The two have to go hand in hand. You have to have job and you have to have product. And if you have just product and no job, at the very least, you should give the situation the side eye. If not, and you should be putting in place policies like trade tariffs that mitigate against that.
And that's why I said, it's not been discussed. This has not been discussed practically my entire adulthood, and that's how I managed to learn, about this entire other side of the country that had been ignored. It's also a part of something that I had learned in moving to Virginia, to get outside of the Washington bubble and to actually speak to people who've been affected
Yeah.
by these types of trade deals. And it in turn also is a part of why we had the Kenosha's, the Baltimore's, the some of the other cities that had the Fergusons,
Right.
because on top of the criminal justice issues, they all happen to have in common the fact that these were areas that had gone through severe deindustrialization.
Right. St.
And it
Louis,
just
which of
added
course
fuel to the, yes,
is
added fuel to the fire.
Ferguson. Yeah, it's, you mentioned Ferguson, and it's neighboring the big city that it's associated with.
Yeah.
St. Louis has the highest murder rate in the United States. And if you look at what happened to St. Louis, just by the absorption of McDonnell Douglas by Boeing, that cost the St. Louis area thousands of well-paying aviation manufacturing jobs. That was a direct result of government policy. Basically, the Clinton administration killed a defense contract that was crucial for McDonnell Douglas, would have helped to maintain itself and become or continue to be a major competitor to Lockheed Martin and Boeing for defense projects. They killed a defense project, and that so hobbled McDonnell Douglas, along with the fact that Boeing had built almost a monopoly on commercial jet production, that they basically could have gone bankrupt or were in deep financial trouble, and Boeing was allowed to buy them. And that was a crazy idea. We now have one less major defense contractor, so there's almost no competition. In the commercial aviation arena, the only real competitor to Boeing is a company based in Europe and heavily subsidized by European governments, and that's Airbus. How is that good?
Right,
and look
right.
what's happened. Look what's happened with Boeing. Look at the 737 MAX and the horrific, deadly problems with that airplane. Even the Dreamliner, they're now finding all these manufacturing defects. When you don't have robust competition, it invites sloppiness. It invites lowered standards.
Right.
It invites profiteering.
It completely goes against
and again,
capitalism.
that's something that has not been adequately looked at, the effect when you lose those jobs. So all of these cities that have the most severe racial unrest were, as you said, in or near what were once manufacturing hotbeds in our country. And that's very important because that was the ladder to the middle class for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Black people that fled the Jim Crow South, especially after World War II. That was the tail end of the Great Migration, to take industrial jobs in the northern industrial cities, from New York all the way through to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. That was the ladder to the middle class for countless Black people in our country. And basically they were on that ladder and getting those well-paying jobs for about one generation, roughly 25 years. And then in the 1970s, this trend began of offshoring our manufacturing, and this rampant importing of goods from other countries. I call it our importing and offshoring orgy. And so those jobs started right around the time that we started running our first trade deficit as a country, certainly the first in over 100 years. The late 1970s is exactly, you can look at every graph, that is when American middle class incomes began declining. It's when profits as a share of GDP began rising to stratospheric levels. In fact, today, profits as a percentage of GDP, and I love profit, but it's out of balance. Profit is now a bigger part of our economy than it's literally ever been in history, and wages are a smaller part of GDP than they've been, and certainly in many decades, so well before World War II. So, and then we wonder why these inner city neighborhoods are in such distress. Well, guess what? There aren't a lot of great jobs there. And when you look at Southland, if Southland, Chicago,
Hmm.
uh, if the steel industry had not been completely devastated by Japanese imports in the 1980s, Barack Obama would not have, as a community organizer, would not have had a community to organize, because by his own
Well,
statement and his own biography and what he's often said, former President Obama, it was the closing of all those steel mills and the destruction of all those jobs that directly led to the crises in those communities outside of Chicago. And the city of Gary, Indiana was a big manufacturing hub, large black population.
Indiana
Look at
has
the stats for
quite a
Gary, Indiana.
large.
They're just terrible.
Yeah, I think that they have the highest. Uh, was I forgot which drug it was, but that would definitely explain it. The state of Indiana and their drug crisis that's there, and as it pertains to solutions for inner cities, one thing that I wonder is how would a President Jack Kemp have how would that have worked out? And I say that maybe not president, but when he was over HUD about 30 years ago, one of the things that he was pushing for was home ownership for people that were in housing projects. And so that pretty much it was a whole project. And so that basically was watered down to the extent of tearing down projects and, um, building mixed use developments without the home ownership aspect. And
Right.
then we have scenarios like in DC, the south side of the city, Anacostia. I remember asking an elected official, I said that I think in 2012 that maybe 25% of the community they were homeowners. And I said, I don't really think that that's very sustainable for the future. And the
No.
solution was having a type of home ownership fund. These cities all have them. I can't think of the exact name, and adding some more money in it. That's not really addressing the problem, because at the end of the day, you still have to be one of the select few who happen to have, been chosen while the money is available. So
And you have to
um,
have jobs
I think that would have been
to
a different thing. Hmm.
Well, one thing that I've advocated, I think we need, I call myself a Thaddeus Stevens Republican. Not everybody knows who that is, but he was depicted in the movie Lincoln. He was the head of the House Ways and Means Committee during the Civil War. He basically developed the financing mechanism that the Union used, and the financial laid out a system including taxes and borrowing that would enable the Union to financially outmuscle the South, which is a big reason that the Union won. But Stevens is depicted in that movie because he was a radical Republican. He wanted all black people to have equal rights. He wanted the plantations broken up and the land given to the slaves which had worked those plantations, which makes perfect sense. I mean, that was
Right.
a losing country. It was a renegade rogue republic that had lost a war, and we, as the Union, had every right to impose those kinds of, in effect, reparations or those kinds of penalties or settlements with people who, after all, had been deprived their freedom, not just their economic well-being, but also the essence of being an American, which is freedom. So I'm in that camp, and I think we need to do radical things that, frankly, no one's talking about. No one with the Biden administration, certainly nobody with most Republican office
Right.
holders, to really focus on advancing Black people economically in the United States. And one thing that I think we should do is vastly increase home ownership. And these public housing projects, if somebody, which of course are not entirely, but predominantly populated by Black and Latino people, if someone has lived in a housing unit, maintained the unit, and maintain certain standards for a period of, let's say, 2 or 3 years, or maybe you say 5 years, that person should be able to buy that unit. And they should get as good a deal on the financing as the Wall Street banks got for the bailout, after the financial crisis
Right.
in
That's why I brought up Kemp. That was a very nice idea that I have yet to see come back up in the
and
last 30 years.
it's not a priority, really, for any party. And that's really unfortunate, because we have one of the most the most massive wasting of human potential in the United States is Black Americans, and certainly to some extent Latinos, but even more Black Americans. We continue to undereducate, improperly educate low-income Black children in our country. Black people do not have the opportunities that they should have in many realms of our society. White people dominate every realm of our society, including rap music and sports, in terms of decision making, controlling the money, controlling the businesses and the organizations. And so it really, I believe that white people need to be passionate about Black American advancement. It's not that Black people need white saviors. It is not that they can't do amazing things working together and in their own behalf as a group. But when you have a people group, when you have white people that historically enslaved and then subjugated and brutalized Black people for hundreds of years, and that group happens to still be in control of the major levers of power and financing mechanisms in our country, it's incumbent upon them to help elevate this people group that is in a collectively much worse situation because of the history that they've experienced and that people group has experienced.
Yeah, and speaking of history, I'm definitely a small government fanatic, and part of the reason being that we've had our share of Black Wall Streets in the country. There were plenty of thriving Black communities, and even places like DC, we've had several iterations of history of where those communities were destroyed. I have a former business partner. We worked together about 10 years ago, and she was telling me about Southwest DC and how there were parts of that. There was a thriving Black corridor, and that had been destroyed. And I didn't know to what extent. And just in doing some recent research, I didn't realize that the feds took out an entire quadrant of the city, a whole fourth of the city. That's pretty big. And how people were talking about how they had to start, traveling all uptown to do their shopping and having this lack of a sense of community. And, in some of these cases, senior citizens who were displaced, I guess they felt like they had lost the will to live. A lot of them had started passing after that happened. But it's not that it can't be done. As I said,
it has to be a priority. It has to be.
Yeah.
And you mentioned
and to
development
keep the government
clearance all over the country and major cities all over the United States in the 1950s and 60s. You had interstate highways that they just ripped them right through the city, and they often, and not by accident, they created a separation, a wall between primarily minority areas of the city and, let's say, the central business district.
And took out the Black side.
Pardon me?
I said, and took out the Black side while they were doing it. Well, if anything had to be taken out, they made sure that they went after that first. One of the worst examples would be in Baltimore. There's this highway to nowhere. Normally, if you're going to do something like that, if you're going to destroy our whole business district, at least let it be productive. No, they started working on the highway, and it literally stops and goes nowhere.
Not good.
So,
yeah,
just as one of those many examples.
It's just so much of, you talk about being for small government. We've seen what can work in terms of government policy and the free enterprise system that we have. And I think the amazing development of these vaccines by Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, others, is a great example of where government can be a catalyst. Government can help set a mission for the country, certainly in something as crucial as saving lives during a pandemic. But then mobilize the private sector to actually get the work done, or most of the work done. You can have a robust NIH, robust basic research funded by the federal government, and then you pair that, make that available to private industry, private companies who are going to innovate, who are going to take that research, take the learnings from these government laboratories and commercialize them and do it in a way that's efficient and viable and for most of them profitable. That is a great combination. And so I think some of the small government people, too many Republicans want to demonize all of government. They want to defund, long before the defund the police, we had a lot of Republicans that basically wanted to defund the federal government, except when it came to defense. That's not smart either. We can do a hell of a lot better job running government agencies. We need civil service reform. We need to build financial incentives for bureaucrats to do a better job. That's not hard to do. You can measure the throughput. You can measure the results, even on welfare programs. There are a lot of ways to measure the success of government programs, and then pay financial bonuses to those workers who are part of units that are doing a better job or showing the most improvement. That doesn't just have to happen in the private sector. That can happen in government too. Yeah. We want a strong government. Bill Clinton said after his party was shellacked in the 1994 midterm elections, when he made his State of the Union speech, he said, "The era of big government is over," which was a great line, got a lot of applause from conservatives. But he added another line, which doesn't get as much mention, and that is, "But we must have a strong government." And I don't know why Republicans and people that actually believe in America first, as I do, think that a weakened government, an underfunded government, a government that allows our country to be teeming with people that are way below potential economically, much more susceptible to getting into criminal activity, into drug use, alcoholism, why they think it's okay to let all that happen. I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump over, because I think it relates to that point, to this whole election fraud issue that President Trump has heralded, and his people, and the Sidney Powells are out there, and Rudy Giuliani is out there talking about. Well, first of all, why in the world didn't the Trump campaign and President Trump personally push hard for his supporters to vote by mail and to vote early? What was this obsession with voting on election day? I mean, we talked at the beginning of this podcast, 2020, anything could happen on election day. We could have had massive power outages. We could have had a massive cyber attack that shut down voting. We could have had acts of nature. We could have had storms or earthquakes that would have interfered with voting. You never want to push any important decision or any important activity to one day if you can spread it out over a period of weeks where you have a little more margin for error.
That's too much common sense, Lee.
But getting beyond that, and by the way, Trump and the Republicans had 2 million volunteers knocking on doors. The Democrats weren't doing that except at the very end, but they had 2 million volunteers across the country in the swing states knocking on doors. That was the perfect army to drive early voting and mail-in voting. In many states, they probably could have handed the voter a blank ballot, and said here, or given them instructions on how to get the mail-in ballot or how to vote early. Right. Trump had the infrastructure to do that far more than did the Democrats. He initially had a massive digital advertising advantage over the Democrats, which is a great way to drive early voting. You always want to bank your votes. That's not a Democrat thing. That's just that's a good politics thing. And for many years, when the only way you could vote early, a couple of decades ago, but in most places, the only way you could vote early was to get an absentee ballot. And Republicans used to dominate absentee ballots. Republicans always saw absentee voting as a pillar of winning an election, and they worked hard to get people to vote absentee if they didn't think they'd be able to vote on election day. Well, what happened? So that was the first mistake. But the other big mistake is, where are these so-called locuses of voter fraud? Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Atlanta. What do those cities have in common? Well, first of all, with the exception of Atlanta, they were part of this deindustrialization that created poverty, especially minority areas.
I like where you're going with it.
They're also overwhelmingly Democratic. Those cities are completely dominated by the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party dominates the voting mechanisms, all the people involved in the process of voting and vote tabulation is dominated by the Democratic Party. And to say that, well, we'll get some Republican poll watchers in there on election day and that'll make up for that is pretty ridiculous. And the reason Democrats dominate those cities is because the Republican Party has handed it to them. They have ceded the big cities to the Democratic Party and just assume that Republicans can't get much of a vote among Black people and Latinos that are predominant in these large cities.
I would like to remind everyone that when I came to Petersburg, Virginia, that I helped in creating our local GOP here. They had not existed for probably about 7 years. And I watched the Fear of a Black Republican, that film where they have all of these people interviewed, where they talk about all the reasons not to invest in campaigns or a committee there. But the first step is to show up,
Absolutely.
and then to work from there. And we did this, and I'm quite active here without
Props to you for doing
receiving
that.
any money in the beginning.
You're a trailblazer, and we need a lot more of them. And frankly, we need a lot of white Republicans to say, we want a lot more Black voters. We are a party, if we have our act together and if we do some sterilization.
The message works for everyone.
We're a great party. We believe in individual opportunity. We believe in rising up and improving one's position through work and through education. We're the perfect party. And here's the metric that really grabs me, Vonnie. In the three most Republican voting states in this just past 2020 election, mm-hmm. West Virginia, Idaho, North Dakota, I believe those have the three highest percentages for Trump. Even in those three states, those overwhelmingly ruby red, bright red, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer red states, Joe Biden got about 30% of the vote. Okay, he got 30%, even in West Virginia, North Dakota, and Idaho. He got right about 30%. We didn't come, I say we, meaning Republicans, didn't come close to that in any of these big cities where the election fraud is alleged to have occurred. Sometimes it was 5%, 10%, and this isn't even without the fraud. This is an abnormal Republican election. We're getting, if we're lucky, half of that percentage, maybe 15%, in a lot of these big cities for voting for Republican. So you can't turn large cities in our country over to one political party you can't allow those big cities to be small one-party states, so to speak, right. And then wonder, why maybe things don't always go the Republicans' way. Again, we don't have right. The widespread voter fraud. It could have happened. It's not impossible, but it certainly hasn't been proven. But the point is, you have to have a seat at the table. As you said, a big part of life, and I forgot what the percentage is it 70? I've forgotten who coined the phrase, but a big part of life is showing up. It's being present. It's having a seat at the table. And if 30% of the people working in these municipalities were Republicans, or if at least 30% of people in these cities were voting Republican, believe me, Republicans would have a lot more influence, not just on election day and the early voting, but throughout the year when the rules are made, when the systems are set up, when the software is programmed and installed. They would
just being
have much more
there,
ability to intervene.
Yes, in all aspects of life in these cities. And I can tell you, as a former municipal employee, just being a Republican, sitting at work, and observing what's going on. And my
you
boss,
put a line of fire there. You know what that's like.
I really was. I was in probably one of the more tougher municipalities in the region. But my boss had pointed out to others, about me being a Republican. Vonnie's watching, but in all seriousness, as far as, and even he was a fiscal conservative, he had his fiscally responsible ways, despite being a Democrat. But, just to have the other set of eyes. And I'm always letting people know in the city here, what's going on, so that, there's a city council meeting. Hey, just show up. Ask a question. I'm not asking you to volunteer to do something, or give me the question and I'll ask it. People don't know what to say. And I tell them that, I don't necessarily always do either. I'm not even from here. I show up to places. I tend to be one of the last ones leaving, usually at most of these meetings, because I'm hanging around, talking to people to find out what the issues are. We also fail in trying to turn these cities around because we don't know what's going on. We come in with our preconceived notions, right, ready to correct people that live there. And I just tell people, just just be quiet and just let people talk. that's
Yeah,
just
and
that's
people,
all you have to do.
it really is a patronizing attitude. It's a throw in the towel mentality that
I've been
Republicans
there before,
have.
honestly, on the other side of that
Yeah,
argument. To be fair, not being from these areas, it was literally exactly 10 years ago when my friends called me to shadow them as a citizen journalist through the south side of DC, and I quickly learned a lot of what I had known was wrong. But go ahead.
well, you have to have accountability. And I think, I don't know how the Republican Party can call itself a national party when it has almost no votes, no infrastructure in the largest cities in our country, and in now the largest state in our country, where all the population centers are overwhelmingly Democrat in California. It is just, you cannot turn over your great cities, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C. You can't turn, and Houston, Texas, you can't
Yeah.
turn them over to the Democratic Party and say, well, we just won't go there. We'll focus on rural voters and suburban voters. Well, how did that work out for Trump in 2020? He also started losing suburban voters. And there's a vicious cycle here, because a lot of suburban voters, especially suburban women, are unnerved by the racial unrest. And I don't mean unnerved meaning they're scared necessarily of black people. They're unnerved that our country is not doing more to keep this from happening. They share the concern. Look at all the polls. The overwhelming majority of white people in the United States think that our criminal justice system is not fair to black people, and that black people are disadvantaged in that system. That's the overwhelming majority of white people. So this has got to be a national priority. We need to win over, as Republicans, we've got to win over African Americans, Latinos as well. I've told Republicans that I know, Republican operatives and conservative leaders, I've said, we hear a lot about how Latinos are natural Republicans. And, we should really focus on Latinos. And I'm all for that. That's probably true. But hidden in that kind of thinking is they also usually have less melanin than black people. I mean, it is, they look a little bit
Good
more like
point.
me, probably.
Right.
I mean, I hate to say it, it's an uncomfortable thing to say.
Good
I don't
point.
think it's conscious for the most part, but I think subconsciously there's a kind of a color line. And if most people in a people group, most African Americans have darker skin than most white people, um, that is almost it's almost like it's infected the thinking of conservatives, and they just have dismissed that crucial segment of our population, and an even more crucial segment in the big cities, which are still the lifeblood of our country. So we need a lot of re-education. We need
Yeah.
a lot of rethinking by white people and conservatives. We need to, as I've said for a few years now, redefine conservatism, actually define it properly, but take back the definition, because conservatism to me is about pro-Americanism. And you can't be pro-America, you can't be America first and tolerate a situation where African Americans have a dramatically higher poverty rate, dramatically higher incarceration rate than the population as a whole. That's just not acceptable. That's not America first. That's not making America great.
It absolutely isn't. I mean, I look at there's a community in DC called Anacostia, and in the list of things that you can lose your liquor license for is an illegal poetry reading. Now, just imagine, you lose your entire livelihood in business because apparently when you applied for your liquor license, you didn't let them know that I might have a poetry reading or two there. And I say that just to show how these, and particularly the big cities, how their rules and regulations, how much they harm the citizens, and particularly around the communities that they have no desire to have. Those are the ones that they decide to regulate to death. Hence, me being a small government conservative. Again, we are perfectly capable of running these communities if the government can essentially take their boot off of the neck of the people who live there.
We need a Marshall Plan for our big cities, and not a Marshall Plan like the war on poverty that LBJ set in motion, which was government centric. But we need a Marshall Plan that mobilizes the private sector. We need to do in our most distressed urban areas what we did to get these vaccines developed for COVID. We need to mobilize the private sector to create incentives and, where necessary, rules of the road for the private sector to make a black advancement, to make the growth and improvement of low income people's economic situation better, but use the private sector to do it. And Robert Kennedy, everybody thinks of him as a real lefty or an ultra liberal. Robert Kennedy was said frequently on national television that his concern about the war on poverty, which had been set in motion by LBJ, was that it didn't sufficiently harness the private sector, that a lot of these programs and a lot more success could be achieved if the private sector was more involved and more mobilized. That was Robert Kennedy, which sounds a whole lot like what Jack Kemp, whom you were alluding to,
Right.
I had the pleasure of meeting and working with a little bit on a business project a few years ago before he died. It's that same kind of thinking, and that does work. But again, it has to be a priority, and we cannot say that keeping Wall Street banks comfortable and not too worried and cushy, that's a national priority, but then allowing these vast areas of privation and dysfunction to continue, that really isn't a priority. I mean, we should do something about it, and we'll do a little about it when we get around to it. But meanwhile, let's make sure that J.P. Morgan Chase and Citibank and Bank of America, let's make sure that they're comfortable and that we don't freeze up our capital markets, and let's make sure Goldman Sachs is happy and not too worried about anything that we're doing. I'm sorry, that's not America first. That's America insane. And we've got to start to balance that policy equation. And I hope maybe it's ironic. Maybe Joe Biden's administration will actually do that. I mean, I hope for the
terribly
likely, but not impossible.
Right. I mean, of course, I'm hoping for the best. I'm not going to hope that the next administration fails, especially not considering what we've all had to deal with this year. But in
we're all in it together.
Right, and saying that Republicans need to be dispatched inside of local communities. And there in Petersburg, we have a local activist that's always pointing out blight, and he tends to mention what could be done with this, possibly by our city government. And I always respond with, well, the city is hoarding something like 100 properties, which generally tends to be the problem. Most of these cities have municipal governments that buy all the vacant property, and they're sitting on it for whatever reason. And could you just imagine if this could be in the private sector, what could possibly happen with it?
Urban homesteading, which I think is something Jack Kemp talked about, Republicans talked about, 30, 40 years ago, urban homesteading. I mean, we need to be really ambitious about equipping people in these communities with business skills if they don't have them, entrepreneurial skills, and make vacant land, vacant buildings available to them or available on very advantageous terms. This PPP program, Paycheck Protection Program for small businesses, I think we're onto something with that. I don't think that should just be a pandemic thing. I think there should be that kind of financing mechanism available to low-income people that are starting or running businesses and to small businesses. That's an example of government. Yes, government spending money, but it is being used to catalyze a more vibrant private sector. And we don't have enough entrepreneurialism in this country. And if the federal government can backstop and provide student loans so people can go to college, I don't know why it can't backstop and provide a lot more resources for especially minority-owned
businesses. Should be promoting entrepreneurship.
Being started or run by people from low-income people groups. So I think we need kind of a PPP that continues, that's not just related to the pandemic.
I think
You
I
have to have
agree.
accountability. You have to have uh, close scrutiny to make sure that it's not cronyism. You don't want the government micromanaging the companies, but
Right.
PPP has worked beautifully because the government didn't get in and manage the businesses. It didn't say, let's look at your books, how many people, who's doing what, what's your
Right.
workflow, what kind of software are you using. They didn't micromanage these businesses. They just provided financial resources. The businesses had to provide tax returns and documentation. But it was a very hands-off program, and yet we know it saved thousands of
Yes.
businesses and millions of jobs in this country. And the government didn't have to hire these people and give them government jobs. These people were able to keep the jobs that they had because of a financial backstop, a financial lifeline from the federal government. Well, if we can do that during the pandemic, let's modify it, but extend
Yes.
that idea for these emerging businesses, these nascent businesses, these businesses that are owned by historically low income people from historically low income groups. Let's give them more financial resources so that they can start a business and have a little bit of runway to get that business successful and profitable.
I 100% support that. I think that is one of the top ways to get people out of poverty. And and that's juxtaposed with, say, I know that there was some type of uh, career training program that DC government had where there were people who weren't showing up for it because they said they were teaching them things like how to write a resume or just you could tell someone was getting a grant to run a program to do nothing, basically, where no one learned anything out of it. Uh, let's
But
say
who
this
knows
is
how to
after,
train people, Lonnie? Who's pretty good at training people?
oh, the
Companies.
private sector, of course.
Company. Not all
Not
training
government
programs are
employees.
great. Some companies do a lousy job, but Brinker International, the people that own Chili's, uh, they know how to train restaurant workers. They're really good at it.
Yeah,
They've had a lot of success with it. There are a lot of companies that are excellent at training workers. Well, why can't the government provide more resources, more incentives for a lot more of that training, and not
there you
just the
go.
training, but also the hiring of these people? That's something, again, let's marshal the private sector to help us solve some of these
Hmm.
intractable or seemingly intractable problems. We don't need people that are living off of a government grant or working in a government office to be administering this. Let's have
Hmm.
the entities that are quite successful training and hiring people. Let's just have them do more of it, and let's provide
Seems
the
to make
financial
sense.
incentives for them to do that.
Seems to make sense to me. And just the reason why I gave that comparison is because they have these low expectations for these people. And I would add that if these are people who might have come in with, say, a rap sheet, I would then add that most people who have been involved in crime rackets of any type know a thing or two about capitalism. So I think that they would be fine if you were to put them inside of a business environment. They know
Yeah.
all how to do all of these things, say, off of the books. And before I go, listen, 2020, how do you think that history is going to, well, how do you think history will both um, uh, reflect on the president, on Trump's presidency and just this year in
Well,
general?
I think the year will be looked at a lot like 1861 when the Civil War broke out, like 1968 when the country almost fell apart. You had two high-profile assassinations, including Robert Kennedy, to whom I alluded earlier.
Right.
You had the Vietnam War, the protest. I mean, our country was even more divided, and arguably in the midst of a bigger political crisis than it's been
Yeah.
this past year. So I think it will be one of those types of years. In terms of President Trump and his handling of the pandemic specifically, I think historians tend to be leftist. They tend not to be big Trump supporters, and probably that will continue
Unfortunately.
for the many decades hence when these history books are being written. So I don't think they're going to be terribly kind to Trump, but I think President Trump, brilliant as he is instinctively as a politician in many ways, he has a lot of blind spots and a lot of denial. And if he had simply said, let's wear these damn masks so we can open up the country, that would have made a huge difference in the entire trajectory of the disease. It probably would have greatly lowered the infection rate and the death rate, the tragic level of deaths that we've had. And he would have, frankly, looked a hell of a lot better politically. This idiocy about not wearing masks was ridiculous. This demonizing public health officials was political malpractice. It was not only immoral, but it was stupid politically. President Trump didn't have to do that. If he had simply worn a mask, if he had simply not gotten into fights with Anthony Fauci, or not elevated Fauci to such prominence in the first place, to where he even felt the need to take him down a couple of notches, and had focused on the vaccine, the Operation Warp Speed, that has been an absolutely astounding public policy success, along with right there alongside development of the atomic bomb that ended World War II. That would be his legacy. But instead, he's going to be remembered as an anti-masker, as a guy who got COVID. Say what you will about the Biden campaign and the emerging Biden administration. Neither Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, or any top Biden advisor, official, campaign staffer contracted COVID. Okay, now admittedly, they had a much more truncated, restricted campaign. They didn't have the big campaign rallies that Trump had. But at the end of the day, one campaign, one administration had COVID running rampant, from the president to his top advisors to former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie on down, Rudy Giuliani, rampant. Trump's kids, Trump's wife, practically everybody that was anybody in that administration or campaign contracted COVID. Virtually nobody. I think one or two Harris staffers got COVID, and they were lower level staffers, not one of the candidates, not one of the candidates' spouses or children, not one top campaign official in the Biden campaign to date, because it could change tomorrow, but so far through the election, contracted COVID. What does that tell you? So I think that is going to be a stain on Trump's legacy.
Unfortunately, and one of my biggest issues with Trump, I mean, I was a day one supporter, and it is throughout this year, was that, as a leader, one of the leadership traits is how you make people feel. And, his messaging around COVID and these pressers that he was doing was really sort of sending people on edge. And
you don't want to scare people. The first rule of political leadership is don't scare people or make them any more frightened than they already are.
Right. So just a lot of what happened due to things that he said just was very unnecessary. And as someone who throughout his life has had many second chances, here it is, the last year of your presidency, you have a captive audience, literally sitting at home with nothing else to do than to watch you on television. He could have completely turned things around, but at the end of the day, he was able to do well with the vaccines, and 2020 it will definitely be one for the books. Listen, Lee, thanks for coming on. Could you let everyone know where to find you?
We covered a lot of ground. I hope it wasn't too discursive for our audience, but it was
not at all. That was
dialogue with you.
Yes, I sort of have to apologize. That was the longest. That was quite a long 25 minutes. Sorry.
Not worth it. The time flew by, and it's an honor to be part of your podcast, and I hope to be on in the future. And really interesting stuff that we talked about.
Yes, it's always great speaking with you. Could you let everyone know where to find you on social media?
Yes, well, you can find me at Twitter, and that's at Spieckerman. It's just my last name. That shows you how rare the spelling is. And it's P as in Peter, Ieckerman. You can see it on your screen, at Spieckerman on Twitter. And that same last name will find me on IG and on Facebook. And I'm on TikTok too, at Spieckerman. Check out some of my TikTok videos if you have the app. It's easier to use the app on your iPhone or your Android phone. And you can see some of the videos I've posted. You can see the comments that I've received, which might surprise a lot of people coming from a guy who's been a Trump supporter. So check out my TikTok as well. But if you get the name Spieckerman that you see on your screen, that will connect you to the whole wide world of Lee Spieckerman.
All right, so this man beat me. You beat me to being on TikTok.
And I didn't, and not once, a disclaimer, I at no point will be seen there dancing with my shirt off. Yeah, maybe in the future, but as of yet, very different kinds of videos posted, but hopefully interesting. They deal a lot with some of the issues we talked about Black advancement and about what white people need to be doing to prioritize that. So a lot of, not a lot of videos, really right now only 6 videos, but we've gotten nearly 20,000 views. So I hope people will check it out.
Yes, and listen, thanks for coming on, everyone. This will be on it's on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. I think I've added Instagram. And sidebar, I'm looking for a co-host, folks. If anyone is interested, the same as the Poplitz podcast for the celebrity news website, poplitz.com. And until the next time, I will see you all soon.